Denise Bulger and her 2-year-old son James went out for a walk to pick up some groceries from the shopping centre near their house. Denise let go of James's hand to pay for her purchase, and when she looked back, James was gone. One moment he was there, and the next, the toddler had disappeared into thin air. The events that would transpire after Denise let go of James's hand for just a moment can't even be compared with nightmares. This wasn't just murder. This was torture to such a degree that it shook Britain to its core. A killing so brutal that England hadn't seen the likes of it since Jack the Ripper. The crime challenged the legal system and had the entire country divided. When investigators pulled up the grainy CCTV footage, their jaws hit the floor. Surely they were mistaken. What they were seeing on the screen had to be wrong somehow. It couldn't be right, could it? Clearly, the 2 kidnappers on the screen were children, a pair of 10-year-old schoolboys that in that instant became the worst juvenile killers that England had seen in 50 years. Here's the story of James Bulger, the broken baby on the train track. Before we get into this case, we need to set the scene. It was the 12th of February, 1993. On this Friday morning, most of the children in Liverpool were at school, and their parents were out working. Cartoons like Animaniacs and Sonic the Hedgehog were the best things to watch on TV, and vintage game arcades were what kept children occupied on weekends. CCTV was barely a decade old, and the winter months were finally starting to loosen its hold on the country, encouraging the younger members of society to play in the wooded areas and rummage around in junkyards. Children had freedom, they just weren't under their parents' eyes all the time. This case has many stories rolled into one. It's the tale of baby James, who was so young that he hadn't spent enough time on this earth to really have a story at all, and the Bulger family who would never be the same again. It's about a pair of 10-year-old boys who came from broken homes and miserable backgrounds. And finally, it's about the monumental effect it had on an entire country, an aftermath that no one could have possibly prepared themselves for. So, let's start with the lives of the miniature murderers and take it from there. Robert Thompson and Jon Venables both attended St Mary's in Liverpool. Naturally, the boys, both from broken and unstable homes, sought each other out at school, and they became fast friends. It was clear from the start that both of them were going to be troubled children. Robert lived with his single mother and siblings in a Liverpool suburb called Walton. There were 7 children in the Thompson household, all boys. And Robert, who was the 5th in line, had known violence and uncertainty since the day he was born. Both his parents drank heavily, and 5 years before the murder, Robert's father walked out on his family, never to see his sons again. To add to the traumatic abandonment, a week after their father left them, their house burned to the ground in an accidental fire. And in the next 5 years, the Venable household went from bad to worse. John's older brothers, then in their teens, were familiar faces at the police station. Their fights were so notorious in the neighborhood that everyone avoided the Thompsons if they could. Inside the home, neighbors reported shouting matches, and the teenagers attacked each other with fists and knives. Their mother, Anne, called the police for help on more than one occasion before the older children could kill her or each other. The younger Thompson boys resorted to fights at school, and they were known to shout obscenities at their teachers. All of them skipped school on more days than they bothered to attend. The Thompson boys ran wild. Everyone knew it. In 1992, a year before James's murder, the 3 older children were removed from the house after one of the teenagers, 15-year-old Ian, attempted suicide and subsequently requested that he be taken into care out of fear for his mother and siblings. Robert was the most manageable of the 7 boys. His attendance and grades weren't much better than his brothers, but he had at least never shown any signs of aggression outside of the home. Even though he wasn't exactly an easy student in class, his teachers felt more sorry for his deplorable circumstances than anything else. Jon Venables also came from divorced parents, and they shared custody of him and his two siblings. From the outside, the Venables had every intention of raising a well-rounded family, despite the parents' separation. They split their time equally between their children, and both were very involved in their education. His two siblings both had special needs and required more of his parents' attention and care, leaving Jon feeling left out and lonely. So he took out his frustrations at school. His teachers described him as an attention seeker, hyperactive and a truant. Susan Venables had a history of depression, and even though she was known by others as an attentive parent, she struggled with coping with the needs of Jon's siblings and her recent divorce. There was only one occasion when authorities were ever called to the home, and that was when Susan left the children unattended for 3 hours until worried neighbors called the police. But by all accounts, this was an isolated incident, and all else was well inside the Venables' home. Jon was the only one of the two boys who had any record of violence. Besides having trouble keeping him focused on his schoolwork and being in the middle of most fights on the playground, there was also a particularly nasty incident at school where the authorities had to be called in when he tried to strangle another student. Of the two, Jon, who came from the more stable and loving home, was the harder, more troublesome one when you looked at the picture from the outside. Unfortunately, the short life of James Bulger is usually overlooked in this case. With the killers being so incredibly young and the bizarre fascination from the public with the murderers themselves, Jamie, as his parents like to call him, often gets forgotten amidst the chaos. Jamie was the first and only child of Denise and Ralph Bulger, a young and newly married couple. He was their rainbow baby, coming a year after Denise suffered a devastating miscarriage. But when James came along, the blonde little boy made them whole again. He rarely walked anywhere. He ran or danced where he wanted to go. He was at his happiest when he could make others laugh, or when he was listening and dancing to Michael Jackson songs. The warm and loving home his parents provided for him had all the ingredients needed for a bright and joyful child to thrive in. But James never got to experience life. He was snatched from this world just 1 month shy of his 3rd birthday. Now that we have some background on the 3 children that take center stage in this case, let's walk you through that Friday, the 12th of February, 1993. Jon and Robert decided to skip school. This wasn't an unusual occurrence, so even though their absence was noted, it was never reported. The morning was crisp and there wasn't all that much to do. So they headed off to the Strand Centre in Bootle, a shopping complex, where they wandered from store to store, seeing how many items they could shoplift without getting caught. But Jon wanted to steal one specific item, a troll doll, because he said that he wanted to see the doll's bum when you undressed it. They did manage to steal that troll doll, as well as some candy, batteries, and a can of blue paint. At 12:30, they stopped their random thievery and tried to coax a toddler away from his mother. The woman heard Jon say, "We'll take that one," while pointing at her son. Alarmed, she grabbed her children and left the building. It would later come out that they wanted to take the child outside and push him into the busy lunch hour traffic. So it's certain that they were definitely planning on killing a child that day. But where the idea began, and how they came to that conclusion, will forever be a mystery. After their unsuccessful kidnapping attempt, they continued walking through the halls for 3 more hours, looking for another child. And this is where the Bulgers and the 2 school lads' lives would collide. James and his mother had taken a walk to the same centre to pick up some groceries. Her first stop was the butcher's shop, and after she'd made her selection, Denise let go of James's hand to rummage in her purse, only taking her eyes off James for a few seconds. James, a typical toddler, wandered a few away until he was just outside the butcher's door. It was 3:39 p.m. 1 minute later, at exactly 3:40, Denise was seen leaving the shop in a panic. Her son had vanished, and within the next 30 minutes, the police had arrived, and they set out to find the boy. The policewoman that sat with Denise assured her that the curious toddler had wandered into a shop to look at a toy, or that he'd crawled into a cupboard somewhere. But by 5:30, after searching the entire complex, with no sign of little James, officers were starting to get worried, so they kicked the search into high gear. With every passing hour, it became more likely that James had been abducted. Family members and shopkeepers went into the streets. Patrol cars with loudspeakers rode through Bootle, making everyone aware of the missing child. And even the press, who'd gotten wind of the case by now, were out looking for him too. James Bulger's disappearance was being broadcast as far and wide as possible, and by 10, his face was already on the news. At midnight, police had the CCTV footage taken from the complex in their possession, and they spotted James wandering between the shoppers quickly enough. Now these weren't the smooth video recordings we know today. The 90s systems only took still photographs at timed intervals. Nevertheless, the images in front of them were more than adequate to track the child's path. And what they saw play out in front of them was downright confusing at first. At 3:39, James walked out of the butcher's shop on the ground floor, followed by his worried mother just a little over a minute later. The next frame shows James all the way on the 3rd floor, seemingly following 2 older children. Then the shot that would become synonymous with the disappearance appeared. At 3:43 p.m., just 4 minutes after James exited the butcher shop, he was seen holding the hand of one of the children he'd been following, and the 3 of them headed out the door together. All the while, Denise was frantically searching for her son 3 floors below. Was this a pair of teenagers playing a cruel prank? Or were they good Samaritans, concerned about the unattended child? But then why hadn't they taken James to the police when they found him? A press release the next morning plastered the images of the 2 youngsters leading James out of the building all over the news, and Denise and Ralph Bulger pleaded for information from the public, begging the boys to bring their son home. Tips started pouring in. Several people had seen a boy matching James' description around the Leeds-Liverpool canal with 2 older boys. Divers descended on the canal, but they found nothing. By day, 2 junkyards and wooded areas were searched. The railway line and the alleyways were combed over, and the search was spreading all over Liverpool, with the nation following every report with bated breath. This was a search, the likes that England hadn't seen before. Then on the 14th, 46 hours after James went missing, the police got the call that they'd been dreading. The body of a child was found on the railway tracks, or what was left of him, that is. And to make matters worse, the discovery was made by a group of other children who just happened to be playing around the tracks. But the final nail in the coffin was that it was just a few meters behind the police station, practically in their own backyard. Given the state that James's remains was found in, and the fact that he was laying on the train track, led the first responders to believe that James's cause of death was that he was hit by a train. But on closer inspection, it became starkly clear that that wasn't all that happened to James. The reality was much, much worse than a simple accident. This was murder. The worst that the investigators had ever seen in their entire careers. His remains were whisked away to the coroner, and all further information was sealed tight. Police weren't going to allow a single detail to get out until they had the suspects in custody. But still, the identity of the 2 youths that took baby James remained a mystery. While police waited for the autopsy to conclude, they brought in more than 20 children in for questioning. But by now, the public had gotten wind of the fact that James had been murdered, probably by the very children on the CCTV footage. And even though they didn't know the details, word got out that it was a very gruesome crime scene. One of the children brought in was a 12-year-old boy who just happened to be in the area on the day in question. An angry mob stormed out onto the streets, throwing stones and screaming for blood at the patrol car that drove him away for questioning. The boy turned out to be completely innocent, but he and his family still had to flee to hide in another part of the country to escape the crowd that had gathered around their house. Liverpool wanted justice, and if the police couldn't do it, then they'd exact revenge for James themselves. The Bulgers, on the other hand, were unaware of the rising tensions back home. Upon hearing of their son's death, they'd moved into Denise's parents' house to escape the madness that was gripping the nation. The show Crime Watch released the enhanced images of the suspects' faces. It was still quite pixelated, but the improvement sparked recognition in a woman who was watching the program that night. So she called in, saying she knew of 2 friends who were always skipping school and getting into trouble, and she thought the images looked a lot like Robert and Jon. So the police brought the 2 boys in, just like they'd done with every tip so far. Quite frankly, they weren't expecting much more from these 2 than they'd gotten from the 24 other children they'd interviewed in the past few days. For one, they thought at 10, the boys were too young. Up until this point, they assumed that the suspects were around 12 or 13. Besides, Robert and one of his younger brothers had been to the memorial site and put down flowers for James just 2 days ago. Both Jon and Robert were still asleep when the police knocked at the door on the morning of the 17th. Without resistance, their hair still scruffy from sleep, the boys were driven to the station in unmarked cars by men dressed in plain clothes. No one wanted another mob running after 2 potentially innocent children again. The interviews were held separately, and each started simple enough. Both children admitted that they had skipped school and were at the Strand that day. And they both even said that they might have seen James. But it was Robert that made the first mistake. Not only did he admit to seeing the 2-year-old, he even described his clothes, down to the color of his little jumper. Alarm bells started going off for investigators. This much detail, coming from a 10-year-old, was unusual to say the least. Then, the strange responses became more alarming. At one point, Jon asked whether fingerprints could be left behind on someone's skin. That was enough to turn suspicion into certainty. The officers turned up the pressure. After 4 hours, it was Robert who broke first. He said they'd taken James from the Strand, and that when they reached the tracks, James started to cry for his mother, so Jon threw the stolen paint at him. In the other room, Jon wasn't budging under the pressure like his friend was. It wasn't until the officers stepped out of the room and Jon was left alone with his parents that he admitted to them that he was at the tracks with Robert and baby James. But Jon insisted that he hadn't done anything. He just saw what had happened. Throughout his version of events, thinking he and his parents were alone, the officers were listening in on the other side of the window. When presented with this information, both boys continued to blame each other, and neither was willing to get into the details. Police didn't have the final autopsy to compare stories, but at least they had the partial confessions that were enough to prove that the 2 were indeed directly involved. Authorities officially arrested Jon Venables and Robert Thompson on the 20th of February. On that day, their mugshots were released, and their faces became infamous, not just in England, but across the world. The baby-faced 10-year-old murder suspects were the headline of every newspaper and the topic of discussion on every program on TV. The world was enthralled and repulsed by them. No one could believe that those were the faces of someone who'd killed a baby. Still, the grisly reality of what had really happened to James remained up for speculation, but the arrest at least seemed to bring some sense of relief to the inhabitants of Liverpool, but only for a little while.
Bobby, I came round to your house this morning, didn't I?
Yeah.
What did I say to you?
You're listening?
Correct. What for?
James.
James, what about James?
That you said on suspicion of murdering him.
Well, very well remembered.
I never got the boy. I never killed him.
And he said that you took him by the hand and led him out of the Strand shops.
He never. He's a liar.
Calm down, my gosh.
All right, come on, look. But the God's honest truth.
God's honest truth, I'm telling you that we never. He was too scared. He was probably too scared.
After hiding from the public for 2 weeks, Denise and Ralph finally got to bury their son. They hadn't realized just how much of an impact the tragedy had on England until they rode to the church with his tiny coffin. Crowds were lining the streets with flowers and banners. It seemed like the whole of Liverpool and half of England had come to attend the funeral. Thousands of letters poured in from all over the world, and Denise still has every single one of them to this very day. When James was finally laid to rest, the country's rage returned. The day Venables and Thompson first appeared in court to hear their charges, decoy vans were used to confuse the crowd that gathered outside. And sure enough, the decoys were attacked, and a full-on riot broke out. Unfortunately, the mob and the Bulgers would have to wait another 8 months before the trial, and then, finally, every horrendous, agonizing last moment of James's final day on this earth was laid out in front of the world. And it was even worse than anyone could have imagined. Denise did not attend the trial. She was pregnant, and doctors warned her that the stress could cause her to miscarry. And quite frankly, none of the Bulgers could stand the thought of sitting in the same room as the murderers that took their son, nor could they handle the intense public scrutiny that they would surely have to face. The first bombshell to hit the proceedings was that James was the second child that was targeted that day. Up until this point, many still argued that this was just a spur-of-the-moment event that got out of hand. Almost 40 witnesses saw Venables and Thompson walking with the toddler, and their stories mapped out the 3-mile journey to the railway for the court. At first, James was perfectly content, but somewhere around the halfway mark, he started to get tired and cried for his mother. The two boys lied to a passerby, who asked if everything was all right. They told the woman that the boy was lost, and that they were taking him to the police station. After that, they became annoyed with James's crying and started pushing and prodding him forward. By the time they arrived at the tracks, they'd worked themselves into a frenzy, and James was hysterical with fear. Jon threw the blue paint at James, and that seems to be the final straw. The escalating pushing and shoving finally broke out into a vicious assault. Using the items scattered around the tracks, they descended upon the baby. Bricks, a 22-inch iron bar, a child's scarf and a stone were all at one point used to inflict no less than 30 injuries on James. Half of his injuries happened while his clothes were still on, but at some point, most likely while he was still alive, James was stripped naked, and the beating continued. It's impossible to say which blow caused his death. It could have been one of 2 fractures on his head, another blow that shattered his cheek and ear, the iron bar that connected at the base of his neck, or the shoe prints that were imprinted on his chest. By the end of the ordeal, James just had too many wounds to say for sure at what point during the assault he finally succumbed to his injuries. All signs pointed to an unprovoked, premeditated, and crazed ambush. But they weren't quite done yet. When James finally lay dead on the ground, the assault took an even darker turn, if you could believe it. A great deal of damage was inflicted on his genitals, possibly involving the batteries that were shoplifted earlier that morning. Then, with the tortured corpse of their tiny victim now on their hands, Venables and Thompson placed James on the train track, hoping a train would come by and make it look like a train had accidentally run over James. And indeed, an engine came by sometime later that day, decapitating the already torn-up little boy. The jury was given 3 weeks to come to a decision. The question was not of Thompson and Venables' guilt. There was plenty of evidence to prove that they'd done it. They both had James's blood and hair in their shoes. The blue paint was still in Jon's possession, and the multitude of witnesses, some of whom knew the boys long before the incident occurred, left no doubts about who had done the horrendous deed. The question revolved around whether or not they were old enough to know right from wrong, and if this was truly premeditated. If they decided that the two were not responsible for their crimes, then the verdict would be manslaughter, meaning that they'd be released into the world the moment they turned 18. But murder was another thing entirely. Then they'd be sentenced like any other adult. In the end, the jury only needed 6 hours. the now 11-year-olds were both found guilty of the abduction and murder of 2-year-old James Bulger. The day that the verdict was read out was also the only day that Denise and Ralph set foot in that courtroom. 1 month later, Denise gave birth to another son. Michael James Bulger was named after the big brother he never got the chance to meet. Unfortunately, the sentence wasn't what the Bulgers or the public were hoping for. Both convicts only received 8 years for what was undoubtedly the worst case in English history since the 10-year-old killer Mary Bell. The two cases, 50 years apart, were compared with each other many times during the trial. Mary, too, had received a light sentence, and upon her release, she was granted the right to change her name. But she was only 10 years old at the time that she killed 2 children on 2 separate occasions. Would James's killers be awarded the same leniency? Denise wasn't going to let that happen. With the support of the country behind her, she fought for a harsher sentence first in England, and then she took it right up to the European court. She fought in the courts while she and Ralph went through their divorce, and both of them married again before Denise finally won her case. Venables and Thompson's incarceration was extended to 15 years. Sadly, Denise's victory was short-lived. Thanks to overcrowding, good behavior, and a bit of luck, Venables and Thompson were released in June 2001. They served only 8 years in prison, and like Mary Bell, they were given new identities before they walked out free men. Today, Thompson is still in the wind. Jon Venables, however, did not stay out of trouble. He was convicted twice for possessing child pornography. The second time, in 2017, 16 years after James's death, he was found to have a folder in his possession that contained more than 1,000 indecent images of children. Most of them were of a violent nature. He was convicted and denied parole when he applied, but the details of his arrests, sentencing, and name change have always been kept quiet. Given the enormous impact and anger that the murder caused, it was deemed that Venables would be in enormous danger from a prison population that is notorious for having no mercy toward child predators. James Heap, a man who was incarcerated with Venables at a youth centre in the first years of Venables' sentence, came out with a statement when news of his arrest came to light. Heap says that Venables was never remorseful. If anything, he bragged openly about what he'd done to James Bulger. His boasts and general terrible attitude toward the other children got him into his fair share of scuffles. On one occasion, another boy tried to strangle Venables before staff intervened, and Heap himself punched Venables in the face when the then 14-year-old laughed when Heap asked him why he'd killed James. Even Ralph Bulger, who's always avoided public statements, came out to demand that Venables rot in jail for the rest of eternity, and that his full identity and crimes be made known to the public. Ralph's ex-wife and the public agrees. Despite being a child killer at an incredibly young age already, he proved 3 times now that he is incapable of change. There's no doubt that Venables is beyond saving. But what about Robert Thompson? Was this just a case of an unhappy boy in a terrible home that just happened to meet a depraved individual that brought out the worst in him? Or, like Jon Venables, is he still every bit as unhinged as he was when he was 10? Maybe he's just better at hiding it than his friend John. Unless Robert's identity is discovered, or he commits another crime, we'll never know where he ended up, or what kind of man he became. But what do you think? Is there any chance of coming back from such an inhumane crime? Can a person ever have any semblance of a normal life after killing a baby, no matter how young they were when they did it? Tell us what you think in the comments below, and do like and subscribe if you enjoy the video. Until next time, hug your babies a little tighter tonight, just in case.